Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're zooming in on something huge. I'm talking about the European Union. Now, we usually hear about the EU when it comes to, trade deals or modern politics, but today, we're looking at the whole shebang from a totally different angle. We're focusing entirely on its original foundational purpose, how Europe structurally turned centuries of bloody warfare into history. Let's look at the exact mechanics of how humanity's most successful peace project was actually built from the ground up.
Okay, let's dive right into this. Just look at the contrast here. For the 70 years right before the EU was formed, France and Germany alone fought 3 devastating wars. 3! That was just the terrifying status quo for a continent that, let's be honest, had a really violent history. But since 1957, 0 wars between EU member states. 0. To have an 80-plus year streak of absolute internal peace in the grand scheme of human history, that is a literal statistical anomaly.
And honestly, the sheer magnitude of this didn't go unnoticed. Back in 2012, we saw a massive piece of third-party validation that really cemented the immense weight of this achievement. The Nobel Peace Prize wasn't handed to a single person. It went to the European Union itself. The committee explicitly awarded it for advancing peace, reconciliation, democracy, and human rights in Europe. It's just a fantastic reminder that the EU is way more than an economic bloc. First and foremost, it's a meticulously engineered peace operation.
To really grasp what this project was up against, we've got to look at the deeply ingrained cycle it had to break. It was a relentless drumbeat of devastation. You've got the Franco-Prussian War in 1870, World War I kicking off in 1914, and then World War II exploding in 1939. Millions upon millions of lives lost. We're talking about a vicious, repeating cycle of vengeance and destruction. War wasn't just some accident in Europe, it was a structural feature. So to fix it, they needed a structural solution.
Which brings us to their first absolute breakthrough: economic interdependence. The founders of the EU decided to pool the production of 2 very specific resources: coal and steel. Now, why those 2? Well, because coal and steel are literally the raw materials of war. By putting these resources under shared supranational control, no single nation could secretly build tanks or manufacture weapons without everyone else knowing about it. They essentially made conflict economically irrational. Actually, practically impossible. It's a brilliant little hack of human nature.
And that initial coal and steel agreement, it evolved into a complete blueprint. This brilliantly illustrates what we call the 5 pillars of EU peace. 1. Economic interdependence. 2. Democracy as an entry ticket. 3. Borders transformed. 4. Integrating former enemies. And 5. Structural peace. We're going to use these exact 5 pillars as our roadmap for the rest of this explainer, just to see how the whole machine actually works.
So, moving right along to pillar number 2, democracy as an entry ticket and the EU as a political anchor. You see, joining the EU wasn't just about scoring cheaper imports or boosting trade. The absolute non-negotiable requirement to even get your foot in the door was the rule of law and the protection of human rights. This timeline here is a perfect example of this in action. Spain and Portugal ended their dictatorships in the mid-70s, and Greece shook off a military junta right around the same time in 1974. How did they stabilize their government so fast? Because the promise of EU membership was this incredibly powerful anchor. To get all the economic perks of joining the Democratic Club in the 1980s, they had to completely formalize their democratic transitions. The institution itself literally incentivized freedom.
All right, on to the third pillar: borders transformed from front lines to crossings.
The physical and psychological contrast here is just staggering. Before the Schengen Area Agreement, borders in Europe meant military checkpoints, strict passport controls, and this heavy, lingering sense of geopolitical distrust. You literally had barbed wire separating neighbors. But after Schengen, completely open movement. Borders became nothing more than a road sign you zip past on your daily commute. It's really hard to overstate the visual and cultural shift this created. When everyday commuter freedom becomes the norm, integration happens naturally, and hostility just kind of evaporates.
That brings us to Pillar 4, moving from the Cold War to cooperation and integrating former enemies.
This is without a doubt one of the most ambitious geopolitical moves of the modern era, a massive post-Cold War expansion. Look at the timeline. In 1995, Austria, Finland, and Sweden jump in. But the real seismic shift happens in 2004, and then again from 2007 to 2013. Just look at those names: Poland, the Czech Republic, Hungary, Estonia, Romania, Croatia. These were former Cold War adversaries. Instead of leaving these nations isolated, where they could so easily become future flashpoints, they were fully integrated. They were completely transformed into zones of shared prosperity.
And finally, our fifth pillar, structural peace versus strategic peace.
Now, what's really interesting about this is the vital nuance between two very different types of peace. We really have to understand this to grasp Europe's stability. On one hand, we have strategic peace. This is what we usually see throughout history. It's fear-based, it relies heavily on military deterrence, and it's inherently temporary, because it just depends on a balance of power. Think of NATO, right? On the other hand, we have structural peace. This is interest-based. It's incredibly durable and deeply embedded in everyday institutions and shared economies. And that right there is the EU model.
But to be completely fair and objective here, we definitely have to acknowledge a crucial counterargument. NATO and its policy of nuclear deterrence absolutely deserve major credit. Military alliances kept the balance of power during the Cold War and actively prevented Soviet expansion. That's just a legitimate historical reality. Without NATO's strategic military defense shielding the continent, post-war Europe might have looked very, very different. Basically, it provided the security umbrella under which peace could even be built in the first place.
So, bringing this all together, here is the crucial summary of the EU's unique contribution. While NATO kept the peace externally through that balance of power, the EU fundamentally invented a brand new internal system. They made war completely irrational through economic interdependence. They made democracy a strict prerequisite for membership. They successfully convinced former enemies to choose cooperation. And they embedded peace so structurally into the daily lives of citizens that going to war with a neighbor is now, well, it's totally unthinkable.
Which leaves us with a pretty massive question. Can this framework of structural peace survive future global challenges? Or, even more interestingly, could it be successfully applied somewhere else in the world? As global dynamics keep shifting, it's something we should all really be pondering. The incredible fragility, but also the boundless global potential of humanity's greatest peace project. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer. I hope mapping this out has brought some fresh clarity to how we understand modern history. Keep learning, and I'll catch you next time.